Late morning on a late autumn day in 1964. The tarmac of Sydney Airport lay slick from
Pre-flight checks
overnight
complete.
drizzle.
Fuel and systems.
Clouds low
Confirmed.
and gray
Avionics
against
powered.
the eastern horizon.
Clear. Ready
A
for engine
Fokker
start.
F-27
Pre-flight checks
Friendship.
complete. Fuel and systems.
Registration
Confirmed.
BHF
Avionics
NZ.
powered.
Set ready
Clear.
at the gate.
Ready for engine start.
Engines quiet. Its polished metal reflecting the muted sunlight. Passengers boarded with a quiet anticipation of routine travel. Businessmen clutching briefcases. Families exchanging subdued greetings. The occasional child peering through the windows at the ground crew. The flight crew, captain and first officer, completed their pre-flight checks with methodical precision. Cockpit switches clicked, dials glimmered, and the hum of the auxiliary power unit filled the cabin. Outside, wind whispered through the apron, stirring loose papers and the faint scent of fuel. The flight plan had been filed. Sydney to Melbourne, a route heavily trafficked yet unforgiving in poor weather. Takeoff was smooth, engines rising to full power, tires lifting from wet tarmac. Within minutes, the aircraft leveled, the hum of crews a steady backdrop against the growing murk of cloud cover. Ground control's voice crackled intermittently, routine clearances blending with static. Visibility shrank as the aircraft climbed into a layer of low-lying clouds, a gray, featureless expanse. Below, the familiar contours of highways and rivers disappeared, leaving only instruments to guide the crew. Inside the cockpit, calm competence prevailed. Every instrument reading was noted, every check completed, yet the silence of the clouds outside pressed inward. Time became measured not in minutes, but in altitudes and headings. The air was heavy with anticipation, though no one could see what lay ahead. Somewhere beneath, the rolling hills and farmland of southeastern Australia waited, obscured by fog and shadow. The routine flight, the everyday commute, was about to collide with the unforgiving limits of human perception and the technology of the era. The tension was not loud, it was silent, mechanical, inevitable. In that quiet, Flight 538 moved steadily toward its final challenge. By 1964, the Sydney-Melbourne Air Corridor had become one of the busiest in the Southern Hemisphere. Airlines operated on tight schedules, with multiple daily flights connecting Australia's largest cities. The distance, roughly 440 miles, could be covered in just over an hour by the fastest turboprop aircraft of the era. For passengers, it was routine. For pilots, it demanded precision. Navigation relied heavily on radio beacons, visual references, and rudimentary instrument readings. There were no satellite systems, no GPS, and weather updates were limited to reports from ground stations and occasional pilot observations. The aircraft chosen for Flight 538 was a Fokker F-27 Friendship, a twin-engine turboprop introduced in the late 1950s. It was celebrated for its reliability, relatively quiet cabin, and ability to operate from shorter runways. Its cockpit, however, required careful coordination. The pilots depended on altimeters, directional gyros, and the increasingly standard automatic direction finder, ADF. While advanced for its time, the instruments demanded continuous attention, particularly in poor visibility. The airline operating Flight 538 had established a strong safety record, yet the pressure of maintaining schedules across a high-density route was unrelenting. Maintenance procedures were rigorous but constrained by the resources and technology available. Crews were expected to navigate rapidly changing weather patterns, particularly in southeastern Australia, where fog and low clouds were common in late autumn and winter months. Weather forecasting itself was in transition. Meteorological data arrived in hourly bulletins, often with limited detail on localized conditions. Pilots frequently relied on their own observations combined with sparse reports from other aircraft. The region's topography, with rolling hills, rivers, and scattered farmland, could disappear entirely under a blanket of fog, leaving no visual cues. Even a slight miscalculation in altitude or heading could prove fatal. In this environment, Flight 538 departed Sydney fully fueled, fully staffed, and fully scheduled. The crew had adequate experience. The aircraft was mechanically sound, and the route was well known. Yet, the convergence of technological limits, environmental hazards, and human factors set the stage for what will become a tragic collision between expectation and reality. The stage was set: a routine flight, a capable crew, and a dependable aircraft. But in the clouds above the Victorian landscape, control will become fragile. Flight 538's Fokker F-27 Friendship was a twin-engine turboprop designed for short to medium-haul routes. Its high-wing configuration offered stability in turbulence, and its Rolls-Royce Dart engines were considered reliable. Yet every system had limits. The altimeters of the era were pressure-based, prone to error if incorrectly set or misread, and the autopilot, though available, required careful monitoring. Navigation was heavily dependent on radio beacons, and without visual references, even a minor miscalculation could result in deviation from the intended flight path. The crew consisted of a captain with years of experience on turboprops and a first officer familiar with instrument flying. Both were competent, attentive, and disciplined. Fatigue, while not officially recorded, was always a latent risk, particularly on early morning departures or during periods of high operational tempo. The cockpit demanded constant coordination, monitoring engines, reading instruments, calculating headings, communicating with air traffic control, and cross-referencing radio navigation signals. In cloud or fog, situational awareness relied entirely on instruments, leaving no room for error. The environment compounded the risk. Southeastern Australia in late autumn was notorious for dense fog, low-lying clouds, and sudden visibility loss. On Flight 538, layers of mist obscured the terrain, masking hills, rivers, and roads. Atmospheric pressure changes could subtly affect altimeter readings, and shifting winds threatened lateral drift. The lack of ground-based radar coverage along portions of the route meant that air traffic control had limited ability to intervene or provide guidance in real time. Aircraft systems also played a role. The F-27's autopilot could maintain altitude and heading, but it offered no terrain awareness. The ADF allowed homing on known radio beacons, but in a region with multiple signals and limited visibility, misidentification could lead to gradual deviation from a safe flight path. Redundant safety systems, such as warning alarms for stall or engine failure, existed but were less sophisticated than today's automated alerts. Each system was reliable, but reliability depended on human interpretation. When combined, these factors created a delicate balance. A precise, disciplined crew could manage the aircraft safely, but any lapse, however minor, an altitude misread, a navigational miscalculation, or an underestimation of the fog, could set in motion a chain of events beyond recovery. Flight 538 entered the chain, not as a product of negligence, but as the inevitable consequence of environmental and technological limits intersecting with human responsibility. The aircraft, the crew, the systems, and the environment were all capable individually. In combination, under the pressure of low visibility and a relentless schedule, they became a crucible of tension, a calm before the turning point. As Flight 538 approached the Victorian Midlands, the landscape below had vanished into a featureless expanse of fog and low clouds. The aircraft maintained its assigned altitude, engine steady, instruments glowing softly under the cockpit lights. Communications with air traffic control were routine, calm, measured, no distress yet, only procedural exchanges. The final approach was deceptively simple on paper. The Melbourne flight path required descent over rolling hills, with precise headings to align with navigational beacons. But the weather had deteriorated. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the crew relied entirely on their instruments. In such conditions, spatial disorientation can occur subtly, unnoticed. A slight misreading of the altimeter or minor heading deviation could send the aircraft off course. Minutes passed in quiet concentration. The autopilot held altitude and heading. The radios hummed. The engines vibrated with predictable rhythm. Beneath the clouds, the contours of the land, hills, rivers, and farmland were obscured. The crew cross-checked signal from the radio beacons, confirming positions against their calculations. Then, a critical misalignment occurred. Historical investigation concluded that the aircraft descended slightly below the minimum safe altitude, likely due to a combination of instrument interpretation errors and reliance on visual estimation that the fog denied them. There were no mechanical failures, no alarms triggered, only a gradual, invisible drift toward terrain. The impact sequence was sudden, precise, and silent to the untrained observer. The aircraft struck the terrain in a shallow, forward trajectory. There was no dramatic explosion or fire. The collision itself ended the flight. The final seconds were tragically brief, with loss of situational awareness and low-altitude navigation errors forming the core cause. Emergency response was mobilized immediately, but the dense fog delayed rescue teams, further complicating access to the site. Survivors were few, and the scale of devastation underscored the consequences of subtle errors in a high-stakes environment. Flight 538's crash did not occur due to recklessness, nor was it preventable by current standards of human capability and aircraft systems at the time. It was a culmination of environmental constraints, technological limitations, and human interpretation under pressure, a sobering reminder of aviation's delicate balance. The immediate aftermath of Flight 538's crash was a mixture of urgency, confusion, and methodical inquiry. Rescue teams, hampered by the lingering fog, navigated cautiously over the terrain, following sparse radio signals and eyewitness reports from nearby farms. The site, a shallow depression amid rolling hills, revealed a stark reality: a total loss of the aircraft, yet with no fire or post-impact explosion. Recovery of the victims was conducted with care and respect, preserving evidence for the forthcoming investigation. Authorities initiated a formal investigation led by the Department of Civil Aviation, DCA, the body responsible for aviation safety in Australia at the time. The investigative team faced multiple challenges: limited black box technology, minimal ground radar coverage, and incomplete weather recordings. Yet meticulous attention to detail allowed reconstruction of the flight's final moments. Cockpit instruments were examined, flight logs reviewed, and interviews conducted with air traffic personnel and airline staff. The investigation concluded that Flight 538 succumbed to controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. The aircraft had descended below the prescribed minimum safe altitude, with the crew unable to visually confirm their position due to dense fog. Instrument readings, while accurate, were interpreted within a narrow margin of error, and the autopilot system, capable of holding altitude, could not compensate for subtle navigational misalignment. The report highlighted several critical findings. Weather limitations. Sudden fog and low clouds were a constant hazard along the Sydney-Melbourne corridor. Instrument reliance. Pilots depended heavily on analog instruments and radio navigation, with minimal redundancy. Human factors. Even experienced crews could misinterpret signals under high cognitive load, especially in reduced visibility. Technological constraints. The aircraft lacked terrain awareness systems, automated warnings for proximity to ground. The crash reverberated across Australian civil aviation. Airlines reviewed minimum safe altitudes, approach procedures, and training for instrument flight in poor visibility. Air traffic control implemented more rigorous protocols for low visibility monitoring, and the importance of crew resource management was emphasized. Media coverage was restrained but thorough, emphasizing the tragic inevitability of the accident rather than dramatizing individual stories. Ultimately, Flight 538 became a case study in the intersection of human skill, technology, and environment. The loss prompted procedural changes and reinforced the need for continual advancement in navigation, instrumentation, and pilot training. The accident left an indelible mark on Australian aviation, a quiet reminder of the limits faced in 1964, but also a catalyst for safety evolution. The crash of Flight 538 resonated quietly but profoundly throughout the aviation community. It was not remembered for spectacle, but for the lessons embedded in its silence. Investigators, pilots, and regulators recognized that the accident was a consequence of predictable human and technological limitations, a reminder that even routine flights could become unforgiving when nature, instruments, and judgment intersected. One of the most enduring outcomes was a reassessment of approach procedures in low-visibility conditions. Minimum safe altitudes were clarified, and reliance on single radio beacons was supplemented with improved cross-checking methods. Training programs emphasized instrument proficiency, cross-verification, and cognitive workload management, laying groundwork for what would evolve into modern crew resource management. Technological progress also drew momentum from the tragedy. Terrain awareness systems, more precise altimetry, and redundant navigation aids became priorities for aircraft manufacturers and airlines alike. Even decades later, the chain of events in Flight 538 remains a study in situational awareness, the subtle margins between safety and disaster, and the importance of respecting environmental unpredictability. The site itself, now reclaimed by the gentle hills of Victoria, is quiet. Fog drifts across the land, obscuring contours as it did in 1964. There is no monument, no spectacle, only the continued vigilance of aviation professionals who understand that lessons often learned in silence. Flight 538's legacy is procedural, educational, and cultural. It reminds us that safety evolves through observation, analysis, and adaptation, not panic. The human capacity to interpret instruments, to plan, and to respond under pressure is remarkable, but finite. Aviation history carries such events forward, ensuring that knowledge gained from tragedy becomes protection for the future. In the end, the story closes not with drama, but with thoughtfulness. The aircraft is gone, the passengers remembered, and the skies are safer because those who follow were willing to study the boundaries where skill meets uncertainty.